Chapter 14 Personality, Modules 45 to 47. Module 45 Introduction to Personality and Psychodynamic Theories. What is personality? Psychodynamic theories. Module 46 Humanistic theories and trait theories. Humanistic theories. Trait theories. Thinking critically about the stigma of introversion. Module 47 Social cognitive theories and the self. Social cognitive theories. Exploring the self. Lady Gaga dazzles millions with her unique musical arrangements, tantalizing outfits, and memorable performances. Her most predictable trait is her unpredictability. At an MTV Video Music Awards show, she stirred up debate by wearing a meat dress. A decade later, she performed the national anthem at the most mainstream of events, the inauguration of U.S. President Joseph Biden. Yet even unpredictable Lady Gaga exhibits distinctive and enduring ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. Her fans and critics alike can depend on her openness to new experiences and the energy she gets from the spotlight. And they can also rely on her painstaking dedication to her performances. She describes her high school self as very dedicated, very studious, and very disciplined. Now, in adulthood, she shows similar self-discipline. I'm very detailed, every minute of the show has got to be perfect. Modules 45, 46, and 47 focus on our personality, our unique and persistent patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving. Much of this book deals with personality. Other modules consider biological influences on personality, personality development across the lifespan, how personality relates to learning, motivation, emotion, and health, social influences on personality, and disorders of personality. These modules focus on personality itself, what it is and how researchers study it. We begin with two important theories of personality that have become part of Western culture, psychodynamic theories and humanistic theories, modules 45 and 46. These sweeping perspectives on human nature laid the foundation for later personality theories and for what Module 47 presents, newer scientific explorations of personality. Module 45, Introduction to Personality and Psychodynamic Theories. Today's personality researchers study the basic dimensions of personality, and the interaction of persons and environments. They also study self-esteem, self-serving bias, and cultural influences on our concept of self, that sense of who I am. And they study the unconscious mind with findings that probably would have surprised even Freud. What is personality? Learning Objective Question LOQ 45-1. What is personality, and what theories inform our understanding of personality? Psychologists have varied ways to view and study personality, our characteristic pattern of thinking, feeling, and acting. Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory proposed that childhood sexuality and unconscious motivations influence personality. The humanistic theories focused on our inner capacities for growth and self-fulfillment. Later theorists built upon these two broad perspectives. Trait theories examine characteristic patterns of behavior, traits. Social cognitive theories explore the interaction between people's traits, including their thinking, and their social context. Let's begin with Freud's work, and its modern-day descendant, psychodynamic theories. Psychodynamic theories. Psychodynamic theories of personality view human behavior as a dynamic interaction between the conscious mind and unconscious mind, including associated motives and conflicts. These theories descended from Freud's psychoanalysis, his theory of personality, and the associated treatment techniques. Freud was the first to focus clinical attention on our unconscious mind. Freud's psychoanalytic perspective, exploring the unconscious. LOQ 45-2. How did Freud's treatment of psychological disorders lead to his view of the unconscious mind? On the first day of class, when I ask students to name one psychologist, they always mention Freud. Although today's psychologists question many of his ideas, Freud remains psychology's best-known person, Diener et al., 2014. In the popular mind, he is to psychology what Louis Armstrong is to jazz music. Freud's influence lingers not only in psychiatry and clinical psychology, but also in literary and film interpretation. Almost 9 in 10 U.S. college courses that reference psychoanalysis have been outside of psychology departments. Cohen, 2007. Freud's early 20th century concepts penetrate our 21st century language. Without realizing their source, we may speak of ego, repression, projection, complex, as in inferiority complex, sibling rivalry, Freudian slips, and fixation. So, who was Freud, and what did he teach? Like all of us, Sigmund Freud was a product of his times. The late 1800s, the tail end of the Victorian era, was a time of tremendous discovery and scientific advancement, but also of sexual suppression and men's dominance. Gender roles were clearly defined, with men's superiority assumed. Only men's sexuality was generally acknowledged, discreetly, whereas women's sexuality was dismissed or ignored. These assumptions influenced Freud's thinking about personality. He believed that psychological troubles resulted from men's and women's unresolved conflicts with their expected roles. The female acknowledges the fact of her castration, and with it, too, the superiority of the male and her own inferiority, but she rebels against this unwelcome state of affairs. Sigmund Freud, Female Sexuality, 1931. Long before entering the University of Vienna in 1873, young Freud showed signs of independence and brilliance. He so loved reading plays, poetry, and philosophy that he once ran up a bookstore debt beyond his means. As a teen, he often took his evening meal in his tiny bedroom in order to focus on his studies. After medical school, he set up a private practice specializing in nervous disorders. Before long, however, he faced patients whose disorders made no neurological sense. A patient might have lost all feeling in a hand, yet there is no sensory nerve that, if damaged, would numb the entire hand and nothing else. Freud's search for a cause for such disorders set his mind running in a direction destined to change human self-understanding. Do some neurological disorders have psychological causes? Observing patients led Freud to his discovery of the unconscious. He speculated that lost feeling in one's hand might be caused by a fear of touching one's genitals, that unexplained blindness or deafness might be caused by not wanting to see or hear something that aroused intense anxiety. After some early unsuccessful trials with hypnosis, Freud turned to free association, in which he told the patient to relax and say whatever came to mind, no matter how embarrassing or trivial. He assumed that a line of mental dominoes had fallen from his patient's distant past to their troubled present. Free association, he believed, would allow him to retrace that line, following a chain of thought leading into the patient's unconscious. There, painful unconscious memories, often from childhood, could be retrieved, reviewed, and released. Basic to Freud's theory was this belief that the mind is mostly hidden, figure 45.1. Our conscious awareness is like the part of an iceberg that floats above the surface. Beneath this awareness is the larger unconscious mind, with its thoughts, wishes, feelings, and memories. We store some of these thoughts temporarily in a preconscious area, from which we can retrieve them into conscious awareness. Of greater interest to Freud was the mass of unacceptable passions and thoughts that he believed we repress, or forcibly block from our consciousness because they would be too unsettling to acknowledge. Freud believed that without our awareness, these troublesome feelings and ideas powerfully influence us, sometimes gaining expression in disguised forms: the work we choose, the beliefs we hold, our daily habits, our upsetting symptoms. Personality structure. LOQ 45-3. What was Freud's view of personality? Freud believed that human personality, including its emotions and strivings, arises from a conflict between impulse and restraint, between our aggressive, pleasure-seeking biological urges and our internalized social controls over these urges. Freud believed personality springs from our efforts to resolve this basic conflict, to express these impulses in ways that bring satisfaction without also bringing guilt or punishment. To understand the mind's dynamics during this conflict, Freud proposed three interacting systems: the ID, ego, and superego, figure 45.1. The ID stores unconscious energy, including our libido, a sexual energy force that fuels our pleasure-seeking. Freud argued that the ID tries to satisfy our basic drives to survive, reproduce, and act aggressively. The ID operates on the pleasure principle; it seeks immediate gratification. To understand the ID's power, think of a newborn infant crying out for satisfaction, caring nothing for the outside world's conditions and demands. Or think of people who focus on the present more than the future, those who misuse tobacco, alcohol, or other drugs, and would sooner party now than sacrifice today's temporary pleasure for future success and happiness. Fernie et al., 2013, Friedel et al., 2014, Kia et al., 1999. As the ego develops, a young child responds to the real world. The ego, operating on the reality principle, seeks to gratify the ID's impulses in realistic ways to bring long-term pleasure. Imagine what would happen if, lacking an ego, we acted on our unrestrained sexual or aggressive impulses. The ego contains our partly conscious perceptions, thoughts, judgments, and memories. Around age 4 or 5, Freud theorized, a child's ego recognizes the demands of the newly emerging superego, the partly conscious voice of our moral compass, conscience, that forces the ego to consider not only the real but also the ideal. The superego focuses on how we ought to behave. It strives for perfection, judging actions and producing positive feelings of pride or negative feelings of guilt. Someone with an exceptionally strong superego may be virtuous yet guilt-ridden; another with a weak superego may be outrageously self-indulgent and remorseless. Because the superego's demands often oppose the ID's, the ego struggles to reconcile the two. The ego is the personality executive, mediating among the impulsive demands of the ID, the restraining demands of the superego, and the real-life demands of the external world. If virtuous Connor feels sexually attracted to Tatiana, he might make an ego-driven decision to satisfy both his ID and superego by joining an organization where Tatiana volunteers regularly. Personality development. LOQ 45-4. What developmental stages did Freud propose? Analysis of his patients' histories convinced Freud that personality forms during life's first few years. He concluded that children pass through a series of psychosexual stages, during which the ID's pleasure-seeking energies focus on distinct pleasure-sensitive areas of the body called erogenous zones, Table 45.1. Each stage offers its own challenges, which Freud saw as conflicting tendencies. Freud believed that during the phallic stage, for example, boys develop both unconscious sexual desires for their mother and jealousy and hatred for their father, whom they consider a rival. Such was Freud's 1897 own experience. I have found, in my own case too, the phenomenon of being in love with my mother and jealous of my father, and I now consider it a universal event in early childhood. He believed these feelings cause boys to feel guilty and to fear punishment, perhaps by castration, from their father. He called this collection of feelings the Oedipus complex after the Greek legend of Oedipus, whose failure to understand his unconscious desires led him to unknowingly kill his father and marry his mother. In Freud's era, some psychoanalysts believed that girls experience a parallel Electra complex, named after a mythological daughter who helped kill her mother to avenge her father's murder. Children eventually cope with the threatening feelings, said Freud, by repressing them and by identifying with, trying to become like, the rival parent. It's as though something inside the child decides, if you can't beat the same-sex parent, join M. Through this identification process, children's superegos gain strength as they incorporate many of their parents' values. Freud believed that identification with the same-sex parent provided what psychologists now understand more broadly as our gender identity, our sense of being male, female, neither, or some combination of male and female. Freud presumed that our early childhood relations, especially with our parents and other caregivers, influence our developing identity, personality, and frailties. In Freud's view, conflicts unresolved during earlier psychosexual stages could surface as maladaptive behavior in the adult years. At any point in the oral, anal, or phallic stages, strong conflict could lock, or fixate, the person's pleasure-seeking energies in that stage. A person who had been either orally overindulged or deprived, perhaps by abrupt, early weaning, might fixate at the oral stage. This orally fixated adult could exhibit either passive dependence, like that of a nursing infant, or an exaggerated denial of this dependence, by acting tough or uttering biting sarcasm. Or the person might continue to seek oral gratification by smoking or excessive eating. In such ways, Freud suggested, the twig of personality is bent at an early age. Defense mechanisms. LOQ 45-5. How did Freud think people defended themselves against anxiety? Anxiety, said Freud, is the price we pay for civilization. As members of social groups, we must control our sexual and aggressive impulses, not act them out. But sometimes the ego fears losing control of this inner ID superego war. The presumed result is a dark cloud of unfocused anxiety that leaves us feeling unsettled but unsure why. Freud proposed that the ego protects itself with defense mechanisms, tactics that reduce or redirect anxiety by distorting reality, Table 45.2. For Freud, all defense mechanisms functioned indirectly and unconsciously. Just as the body unconsciously defends itself against disease, the ego also unconsciously defends itself against anxiety. For example, repression banishes anxiety-arousing wishes and feelings from consciousness. According to Freud, repression underlies all the other defense mechanisms. However, because repression is often incomplete, repressed urges may appear as symbols in dreams or as slips of the tongue in conversation. Freud believed he could glimpse the unconscious seeping through when a financially stressed patient, not wanting any large pills, said, "Please do not give me any bills, because I cannot swallow them." Today we call these Freudian slips. Freud also viewed jokes as expressions of repressed sexual and aggressive tendencies, and dreams as the royal road to the unconscious. The remembered content of dreams, their manifest content, he believed to be a censored expression of the dreamer's unconscious wishes, the dream's latent content. In his dream analyses, Freud searched for patients' inner conflicts. I remember your name perfectly, but I just can't think of your face. Oxford professor W. A. Spooner, 1844 to 1930, famous for his linguistic flip-flops, Spoonerisms. Spooner rebuked one student for fighting a liar in the quadrangle and another who hissed my mystery lecture, adding, "You have tasted 2 worms." Retrieval practice. Answers in Appendix E. The Neo-Freudian and later psychodynamic theorists. LOQ 45-6. Which of Freud's ideas did his followers accept or reject? In a historical period when people rarely talked about sex, and certainly not unconscious desires for sex with one's parent, Freud's writings sparked intense debate. In the Middle Ages, they would have burned me, observed Freud to a friend. Now they are content with burning my books, Jones, 1957. Despite the controversy, Freud attracted followers. Several young, ambitious physicians formed an inner circle around their strong-minded leader. These pioneering psychoanalysts, whom we often call Neo-Freudians, adopted Freud's interviewing techniques and accepted his basic ideas, the personality structures of id, ego, and superego, the importance of the unconscious, the childhood roots of personality, and the dynamics of anxiety and the defense mechanisms. But they broke away from Freud in 2 important ways. First, they emphasized the conscious mind's role in interpreting experience and in coping with the environment. And second, they doubted that sex and aggression were all-consuming motivations. Instead, they tended to emphasize loftier motives and social interactions. Alfred Adler and Karen Horney, for example, agreed with Freud that childhood is important. But they believed that childhood social, not sexual, tensions are crucial for personality formation. Ferguson, 2003, 2020. Adler, who gave us the still popular inferiority complex idea, had struggled to overcome childhood illnesses and accidents. He believed that much of our behavior is driven by efforts to conquer childhood inferiority feelings that trigger our strivings for superiority and power. Horney said childhood anxiety triggers our desire for love and security. She also opposed Freud's assumptions that women have weak superegos and suffer penis envy, and she attempted to balance his masculine bias. Carl Jung, Freud's disciple turned dissenter, placed less emphasis on social factors and agreed with Freud that the unconscious exerts a powerful influence. But to Jung, the unconscious contains more than our repressed thoughts and feelings. He believed we also have a collective unconscious shared memories and images that he called archetypes. Jung said that the collective unconscious explains why, for many people, spiritual concerns are deeply rooted and why people in different cultures share certain myths and images. Today's psychologists don't speak of a collective unconscious, but they do assume that our shared evolutionary history indeed shaped some universal dispositions, and that experience can leave epigenetic marks affecting gene expression. Freud died in 1939. Since then, some of his ideas have been incorporated into the diverse perspectives that make up modern psychodynamic theory. Most contemporary psychodynamic theorists and therapists are not wedded to the idea that sex is the basis of personality, noted Drew Weston, 1996. They do not talk about ids and egos, and do not go around classifying their patients as oral, anal, or phallic characters. They assume, with Freud and with much support from today's psychological science, that much of our mental life is unconscious. With Freud, they also assume that we often struggle with inner conflicts among our wishes, fears, and values, and that childhood shapes our personality and ways of becoming attached to others. For a helpful overview, watch this video, Psychodynamic Theories of Personality. Evaluating Freud's psychoanalytic perspective and modern views of the unconscious. LOQ 45-7. How do contemporary psychologists view Freud's psychoanalysis? Modern research contradicts many of Freud's ideas. We critique Freud from a 21st century perspective. Freud did not have access to neurotransmitter or DNA studies, or to all that we have since learned about human development, thinking, and emotion. To criticize his theory by comparing it with today's thinking is like criticizing the Ford Model T by comparing it with a new Tesla Model S. How tempting it is to judge the past from the perspective of our present. Many aspects of Freudian theory are indeed out of date, and they should be. Freud died in 1939, and he has been slow to undertake further revisions. Psychologist Drew Weston, 1998. Nevertheless, both Freud's devotees and his detractors agree that recent research contradicts many of his specific ideas. Today's developmental psychologists see our development as lifelong, not fixed in childhood. They doubt that infants' neural networks are mature enough to sustain as much emotional trauma as Freud assumed. Some think Freud overestimated parental influence and underestimated other factors, such as peer influence. These critics also doubt that conscience and gender identity form as the child resolves an Oedipus, or Electra, complex at age 5 or 6. We gain our gender identity earlier, and those who become strongly masculine or feminine do so even when they do not have a same-sex parent present. And they note that Freud's ideas about childhood sexuality arose from stories of childhood sexual abuse told by his female patients, stories that some scholars believe Freud doubted, and attributed to his patients' own childhood sexual wishes and conflicts. Esterson, 2001, Powell and Bohr, 1994. Today, we know that childhood sexual abuse happens, and we also understand how Freud's questioning might have created false memories of abuse. Modern dream research disputes Freud's belief that dreams disguise and fulfill wishes. And slips of the tongue can be explained as competition between similar verbal choices in our memory network. Someone who says, "I don't want to do that, it's a lot of brothel," may simply be blending bother and trouble. Foss and Hakes, 1978. Searching the more than 300,000 emails I have received since 2000, I see that friends have written me about their experience on Wisconsin Public Radio and about accessibility in pubic venues. One analysis of 40,000 typing errors suggested that such mistakes are probably random typos. Stevens Davidovitz, 2017. History also has failed to support Freud's idea that suppressed sexuality causes psychological disorders. From Freud's time to ours, sexual inhibition has diminished, psychological disorders have not. Psychologists further criticize Freud's theory for its scientific shortcomings. It's important to remember that good scientific theories explain observations and offer testable hypotheses. Freud's theory rests on few objective observations, and parts of it offer few testable hypotheses. For Freud, his own recollections and interpretations of patients' free associations, dreams, and slips sometimes selected to support his theory were evidence enough. What is the most serious problem with Freud's theory? It offers after-the-fact explanations of any characteristic, of one person's smoking, another's fear of horses, another's sexual orientation, yet fails to predict such behaviors and traits. If you feel angry at your mother's death, you illustrate Freud's theory because your unresolved childhood dependency needs are threatened. If you do not feel angry, you again illustrate his theory because you are repressing your anger. That is like betting on a horse after the race has been run. Hall and Lindsay, 1978, p. 68. A good theory makes testable predictions. So, should psychology post and allow natural death order on this old theory? Freud's supporters object. To criticize Freudian theory for not making testable predictions is, they say, like criticizing baseball for not being an aerobic exercise, something it was never intended to be. Freud never claimed that psychoanalysis was predictive science. He merely claimed that, looking back, psychoanalysts could find meaning in our state of mind. Rife, 1979. Freud's supporters also note that some of his ideas are enduring. It was Freud who drew our attention to the unconscious and the irrational, at a time when such ideas were not popular. Many researchers have since studied our irrationality, Arely, 2010, Thaler, 2015. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman, in 2002, and behavioral economist Richard Thaler, in 2017, each won Nobel Prizes for their studies of our faulty decision-making. Freud also drew our attention to the importance of human sexuality, and to the tension between our biological impulses and our social well-being. It was Freud who challenged our self-righteousness, exposed our self-protective defenses, and reminded us of our potential for evil. Although Freud clearly made a number of mistakes in the formulation of his ideas, his understanding of unconscious mental processes was pretty much on target. In fact, it is very consistent with modern neuroscientists' belief that most mental processes are unconscious. Nobel Prize, winning neuroscientist Eric Kandel, 2012. Modern research challenges the idea of repression. Psychoanalytic theory hinges on the assumption that our mind often represses offending wishes, banishing them into the unconscious until they resurface, like a long-lost cat that finds its way home. Recover and resolve childhood's conflicted wishes, and emotional healing should follow. Repression became a widely accepted concept, used to explain hypnotic phenomena and psychological disorders. Some psychodynamic followers extended repression to explain apparently lost and recovered memories of childhood traumas. Bogue, 2006, Chait, 1998, Erdei, 2006. These psychodynamic beliefs have made their way into popular culture. In one survey, 88% of university students believed that painful experiences commonly get pushed out of awareness and into the unconscious. Gary et al., 1994. Today's researchers agree that we sometimes preserve our self-esteem by neglecting threatening information. Green et al., 2008. Yet they also find that repression is rare, even in response to terrible trauma. Even those who have witnessed a parent's murder or survived Nazi death camps have retained their unrepressed memories of the horror. Helmreich, 1992, 1994, Malmquist, 1986, Pennybaker, 1990. Some researchers do believe that extreme, prolonged stress, such as the stress some severely abused children experience, might disrupt memory by damaging the hippocampus. Shatter, 1996. But the far more common reality is that high stress and associated stress hormones enhance memory. Indeed, rape, torture, and other traumatic events haunt survivors, who experience unwanted flashbacks. They are seared onto the soul. You see the babies, said Holocaust survivor Sally H., 1979. You see the screaming mothers. You see hanging people. You sit and you see that face there. It's something you don't forget. During the Holocaust, many children were forced to endure the unendurable. For those who continue to suffer, the pain is still present, many years later, as real as it was on the day it occurred. Eric Zillmer, Molly Harrower, Barry Ritzler, and Robert Archer, The Quest for the Nazi Personality, 1995. The modern unconscious mind. Q45-8. How has modern research developed our understanding of the unconscious? Freud was right about a big idea that underlies today's psychodynamic thinking: we have limited access to all that goes on in our mind. Erdei, 1985, 1988, Norman, 2010. Our two-track mind has a vast unseen realm. Some researchers even argue that most of a person's everyday life is determined by unconscious thought processes. Barg and Chartrand, 1999. Perhaps, for example, you can recall being sad or angry without consciously knowing why. Many research psychologists now think of the unconscious not as seething passions and repressive censoring but as information processing that occurs without our awareness. To these researchers, the unconscious also involves the schemas that automatically control our perceptions and interpretations, the priming by stimuli to which we have not consciously attended, the right hemisphere activity that enables the split-brain patient's left hand to carry out an instruction the patient cannot verbalize, the implicit memories of learned skills that operate without conscious recall, even in those with amnesia, the emotions that activate instantly, before conscious analysis, the stereotypes and implicit prejudice that automatically and unconsciously influence how we process information about others. More than we realize, we fly on autopilot. Our lives are guided by off-screen, out-of-sight, unconscious information processing. The unconscious mind is vast. However, our current understanding of unconscious information processing is more like the pre-Freudian view of an underground, unattended stream of thought from which spontaneous behavior and creative ideas surface. Barg and Morzella, 2008. Research also supports two of Freud's defense mechanisms. One study demonstrated reaction formation, trading unacceptable impulses for their opposite, in men who reported strong anti-gay attitudes. Compared with those who did not report such attitudes, these anti-gay men experienced greater physiological arousal, assessed with a device that measured blood flow to the penis, when watching videos of gay men having sex, even though they said the films did not make them sexually aroused. Adams et al., 1996. Likewise, some evidence suggests that people who have an unconscious same-sex sexual orientation but who consciously identify as straight report more negative attitudes toward gay men and lesbians. Weinstein et al., 2012. Freud's projection, attributing our own threatening impulses to others, has also been confirmed. People do tend to see their traits, attitudes, and goals in others. Baumeister et al., 1998, Monair et al., 2005. Shown an ambiguous face, aggressive people often see anger. Brennan and Baskin-Summers, 2020. Today's researchers call this the false consensus effect, the tendency to overestimate the extent to which others share our beliefs and behaviors. People who binge drink or break speed limits tend to think many others do the same. Shortly before the 2020 U.S. presidential election, 83% of Democrats and 84% of Republicans predicted that voters would elect their party's presidential candidate. ISR, 2020. As we are, so we see others. Finally, research has supported Freud's idea that we unconsciously defend ourselves against anxiety. Researchers have proposed that one source of anxiety is the terror resulting from our awareness of vulnerability and death. Greenberg et al., 1997. Hundreds of experiments testing terror management theory show that thinking about one's mortality, for example, by writing a short essay on dying and its associated emotions, provokes various terror management defenses. Burke et al., 2010. For example, Death anxiety increases aggression toward rivals and heightens esteem for oneself. Cohen and Solomon, 2011, Cole et al., 2006. Faced with a threatening world, people act not only to enhance their self-esteem but also to adhere more strongly to worldviews that answer questions about life's meaning. The prospect of death promotes religious sentiments, and deep religious convictions enable people to be less defensive, less likely to rise in defense of their worldview when reminded of death. Jonas and Fisher, 2006, Norenzayan and Hansen, 2006. Moreover, when contemplating death, people prioritize their close relationships. Cox and Arndt, 2012, Mikulinker et al., 2003. The actual death of loved ones can provoke protective responses as well. For years, I have studied the way people respond to thoughts about death, but it took the shock of my own mother's unexpected death to motivate me to start running again, and to live a healthier lifestyle. Hayasaki, 2014, Koshden et al., 2014. Facing death can inspire us to affirm life. Ask yourself, what understandings and impressions of Freud did you bring to this course? Are you surprised to find that some of his ideas have value, or that others have been called into question? Retrieval practice. Answers in Appendix E. Assessing unconscious processes. LOQ 45-9. What are projective tests, how are they used, and what are some criticisms of them? Personality tests reflect the basic ideas of particular personality theories. So, what might be the assessment tool of choice for someone working in the Freudian tradition? It would need to provide some sort of road into the unconscious to unearth the residue of early childhood experiences, move beneath surface thoughts, and reveal hidden conflicts and impulses. Objective assessment tools, such as agree-disagree or true-false questionnaires, would be inadequate because they would merely tap the conscious surface. Henry Murray, 1933, demonstrated a possible basis for such a test at a party hosted by his 11-year-old daughter. Murray engaged the children in a frightening game called Murder. When shown some photographs after the game, the children perceived the photos as more malicious than they had before the game. These children, it seemed to Murray, had projected their inner feelings into the pictures. A few years later, Murray introduced the thematic apperception test, TAD, a projective test in which people view ambiguous pictures and then make up stories about them. Shown a daydreaming boy, those who imagine he is fantasizing about an achievement are presumed to be projecting their own goals. As a rule, said Murray, the subject leaves the test happily unaware that he has presented the psychologist with what amounts to an X-ray of his inner self, quoted by Talbot, 1999. Numerous studies suggest that Murray was right. The TAD provides a valid and reliable map of people's implicit motives. Jenkins, 2017. For example, such storytelling has been used to assess achievement and affiliation motivation. Drescher and Schulteis, 2016, Schulteis et al., 2014. Swiss psychiatrist Hermann Rorschach 1884–1922 created the most widely used projective test. He based his famous Rorschach ink blot test, figure 45.2, on a childhood game. Unlike the TAT's natural life images, Rorschach and his friends would drip ink on a paper, fold it, and then say what they saw in the resulting ink blot. Storrow, 2005. Do you see predatory animals or weapons? A Rorschach interpreter might speculate that you have aggressive tendencies. But is this a reasonable assumption? considering that ink blots don't have any real-life meaning? The answer varies. Some clinicians cherish the Rorschach test, convinced that it projects a client's inner motives to the outside world. Others view the test as a source of suggestive leads, an icebreaker, or a revealing interview technique. But critics insist the Rorschach is no emotional MRI. They argue that only a few of the many Rorschach-derived scores, such as those for cognitive impairment and thought disorder, have demonstrated reliability and validity. Mihura et al., 2013, 2015, Wood et al., 2015. And ink blot assessments have inaccurately diagnosed many healthy adults as pathological. Wood, 2003, Wood et al., 2006. The Rorschach ink blot test has the dubious distinction of being, simultaneously, the most cherished and the most reviled of all psychological assessment tools. John Hunsley and J. Michael Bailey, 1999. Retrieval practice. Answers in Appendix E. Review. Module 45, Introduction to Personality and Psychodynamic Theories. Learning objectives. Test yourself. Answer these repeated learning objective questions on your own, before showing the answers here, or checking the answers in Appendix D, to improve your retention of the concepts. McDaniel et al., 2009, 2015. Terms and concepts to remember. Test yourself. Write down the definition in your own words, then check your answer. Personality. Psychodynamic theories. Psychoanalysis. Unconscious. Free association. ID. Ego. Superego. Psychosexual stages. Oedipus complex. Identification. Fixation. Defense mechanisms. Repression. Collective unconscious. Terror management theory. Thematic apperception test, TAT. Projective test. Rorschach ink blot test. Module test. Test yourself. Answer the following questions on your own first, then show the answers here, or check your answers in Appendix E. Module 46, Humanistic Theories and Trait Theories. Why the 1960s, some personality psychologists had become discontented with the sometimes bleak focus on drives and conflicts in psychodynamic theory, and the mechanistic psychology of B.F. Skinner's behaviorism. Two pioneering theorists, Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, offered a third force perspective that emphasized our potential for healthy personal growth. Humanistic theories. LOQ 46-1. How did humanistic psychologists view personality, and what was their goal in studying personality? In contrast to Sigmund Freud's emphasis on disorders born out of dark conflicts, the humanistic theorists emphasized the ways people strive for self-determination and self-realization. In contrast to behaviorism's scientific objectivity, they studied people through self-reported experiences and feelings. Abraham Maslow's self-actualizing person. Maslow proposed that we are motivated by a hierarchy of needs. If our physiological needs are met, we become concerned with personal safety. If we achieve a sense of security, we then seek to love and to be loved. With our love needs satisfied, we seek self-esteem. Having achieved self-esteem, we ultimately seek self-actualization, the process of fulfilling our potential, and self-transcendence, meaning, purpose, and identity beyond the self. Maslow, 1970, developed his ideas by studying healthy, creative people rather than clinical cases of troubled people. His description of self-actualization grew out of his study of people, such as Abraham Lincoln, who seemed notable for their meaningful and productive lives. Maslow reported that such people shared certain characteristics: they were self-aware and self-accepting, open and spontaneous, loving and caring, and not paralyzed by others' opinions. Kaufman, 2018. Secure in their sense of who they were, their interests were task-centered rather than self-centered. Curious about the world, they embraced uncertainties and stretched themselves to seek out new experiences. Compton, 2018, Koshden, 2009. Once they focused their energies on a particular task, they often regarded it as their life mission, or calling. Hall and Chandler, 2005. Most enjoyed a few deep relationships rather than many superficial ones. Many had been moved by spiritual or personal peak experiences that surpassed ordinary consciousness. These, said Maslow, 1970, are mature adult qualities found in those who have learned enough about life to be compassionate, to have outgrown their mixed feelings toward their parents, to have found their calling, to have acquired enough courage to be unpopular, to be unashamed about being openly virtuous. Test your own level of self-actualization in Figure 46.1. Carl Rogers' person-centered perspective. Fellow humanistic psychologist Carl Rogers agreed with much of Maslow's thinking. Rogers' person-centered perspective held that people are basically good and are endowed with self-actualizing tendencies. Unless thwarted by an environment that inhibits growth, each of us is like an acorn, primed for growth and fulfillment. Rogers, 1980, believed that a growth-promoting social climate provides acceptance. When people are accepting, they offer unconditional positive regard, an attitude of grace that values us even knowing our failings. It is a profound relief to drop our pretenses, confess our worst feelings, and discover that we are still accepted. In a good marriage, a close family, or an intimate friendship, we are free to be spontaneous without fearing the loss of others' esteem. Genuineness. When people are genuine, they are open with their own feelings, drop their facades, and are transparent and self-disclosing. Empathy. When people are empathic, they share and mirror others' feelings and reflect their meanings. Rarely do we listen with real understanding, true empathy, said Rogers. Yet listening, of this very special kind, is one of the most potent forces for change that I know. Acceptance, genuineness, and empathy are, Rogers believed, the water, sun, and nutrients that enable people to grow from acorns into vigorous oak trees. For as persons are accepted and prized, they tend to develop a more caring attitude toward themselves. Rogers, 1980, p. 116. When heard and accepted, People can listen to and accept their thoughts and feelings. The educator Alice Stewart Trillin discovered acceptance and genuineness at a camp for children with severe disorders. Elle, a magical child, had genetic diseases that meant she had to be tube-fed and could walk only with difficulty. Trillin wondered what this child's parents could have done to make her the most optimistic, most enthusiastic, most hopeful human being I had ever encountered, quoted in Trillin, 2006. One day Trillin spotted a note that Elle received from her mom: "If God had given us all of the children in the world to choose from, Elle, we would only have chosen you." Inspired, Trillin approached a coworker. "Quick. Read this," she whispered. "It's the secret of life." Maslow and Rogers would have smiled knowingly. For them, a central feature of personality is one's self-concept, all the thoughts and feelings we have in response to the question, who am I? If our self-concept is positive, we tend to act and perceive the world positively. If it is negative, if we fall far short of our ideal self, said Rogers, we feel dissatisfied and unhappy. A worthwhile goal for therapists